you, the Rob Jackson.
The Dana Litwin.
The joke that's always funny.
Well, to us anyway.
To the both of us, the audience that counts the most. Uh, Thank you for having a second appearance on Priceless Advice. You are the one of the first guests that I interviewed. We were in a hotel room,
Yeah.
my hotel room in London. My wife and I, she had business there, and I just turned it into a work trip as well. And that was in late January of 2020. So I don't know, has anything happened since then in your life, in the world, that's of significance, do you
Just
think?
just a little bit. I'm slightly worried about what's going to happen as a consequence of us meeting.
It's not in person, so I don't think it's gonna rip space time and push us into the darkest timeline like apparently it did before, because we were talking like three
Oh,
days before the
crazy.
Brexit vote.
Yeah.
And a couple people on my flight home to the States had masks on, and I thought, oh,
Yeah.
maybe they have a cold.
Yeah.
It'll this,
No.
oh well. So that was my last international trip.
The world has definitely gone to hell in a handbasket since then.
Something like that. Maybe there's a cookie in the basket or a biscuit if you're British and in the
Yeah.
Commonwealth. Yeah, major change, lots to get caught up on. So thank you for making time
Hey,
again for
pleasure.
this. And how are you? There's a new king.
There is.
There's lots going on in the sector worldwide, but especially in UK. And you've had some great Engage articles in your own 200 Word
Thank you.
Tuesdays, and your own podcast has started since we last talked.
Yeah.
Like there's quite a bit to get caught up on in this hour together. So get me updated.
Yeah.
What's
I've
going
had,
on?
if you could put it that way, I've had lots of work babies since
Yeah,
since we last spoke.
so many
No,
work
I'm
babies.
Yeah, we've launched a podcast, Advancing the Profession, which took way more work than I thought it was going to do.
I
And
could have told you that.
yeah,
Talk to me next
geez,
time you want a media production work baby, and I'll tell you all the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. But
my
this is for
my
some of the
advice
good.
my advice coming out of that is be prepared for more than one season when you record the first season, because it's been over a year since we did the first season, so the second season won't be coming out till 2023. But also try not to interview people that you really like when you've not got the hang of editing, because then you try and edit out every single and and it becomes incredibly frustrating. So that's two practical tips. It's a priceless advice if you're going to set up a podcast. So the podcast has come along. I've been playing around with these 200 Word Tuesdays. So they go out on LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter every other week, straight after my blog posts go out on a Friday, and then the 200 Word Tuesdays go out the following Tuesday, which is literally just a challenge. I read an article and a guy said any idiot can write a 1,500 word blog post, but try getting a cogent argument across in 200 words. So
Challenge
that's actually been,
accepted. Yeah.
yeah, it's actually a really interesting writing challenge. I'm not sure I get a lot of engagement on them. So maybe people will leave comments on this video saying don't stop writing them, or maybe people will leave comments saying please stop writing them.
Rob, please stop. That's it. That's the only comment. They're like, delete comment or be transparent.
Yeah,
They can't, but, yeah, it's a lot of work. And
it is
any
huge.
any content creation is a lot of work, and editing is media production, and
Yeah,
editing in writing, and editing in sound, and editing in video. And I've got myself and a few professionals as my backup editing team, because if I tried to do all of the writing and all of the editing, I wouldn't have any other work.
yeah. I know that feeling.
Yeah,
Um,
but I think you've paced it really well, and I appreciate the launch and when we cross promote with each other. And I think it's been important to see the growth of podcasts, yours and
yeah,
Viridian's, and the expansion of, Toby Johnson's doing.
Toby now has two.
She has two podcasts. I'm going to be on Volunteer Nation in November, at least record in November. So it's great that we're kind of
Yeah.
broadcasting so much more and having so many conversations. Do you think this is the only silver lining of our previous interview, throwing us into the darkest timeline, or is there more?
I don't think it's the only silver lining. I
Oh, good.
think, yeah, I think there have been some. I mean, I've kept saying I think the biggest silver lining coming out of COVID is it's given everybody, not just in volunteer engagement, but it's given everybody the opportunity to press a big red reset button. Like there's this kind of mythical button next to us that we've just been able to hit. And for some people, that's meant, all the kind of things that have led to the Great Resignation and people deciding they're not going back into work, or they're not going back into poorly paid kind of menial work. And that's caused a whole bunch of issues for your society, my society. But in volunteering terms, what it's done, I think, the argument I kind of put across is very little of the change that we've seen in volunteering during COVID was change that we didn't know was coming down the line. We always knew there were going to be big changes in demographics. We always knew people wanted more flexible volunteering. We always knew we needed to up our game in tech adoption. It's just that instead of it taking what I would have said 3 years ago would be 5, 10, 15, 20 years, it happened overnight.
Yep.
23rd of March, 2020,
yep.
UK went into lockdown, everything stopped, and we had to adapt and we had to change. And it's like the bit of elastic. You pull a bit of elastic too hard, it doesn't take its shape again afterwards.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we've been. So the opportunity for us as volunteer engagement professionals, if we survived COVID, like literally, but also if we survived the furloughs and all the other stuff, to press that button. But what shifted for me, I would have said pre-COVID, 80% of my work was training, speaking at events, 20% was consulting. That flipped.
Yeah, for me too. Yep.
Suddenly, now that's interesting, because suddenly I've got organizations going, we can't do things the way we did them before. We need somebody to help us with volunteering strategy. So personally, that's a cloud, silver lining to the cloud. But I think it's really interesting that those conversations haven't always just come at the instigation of the volunteer engagement professional. It's come at the instigation of the HR vice president or the chief executive or the exec director or people like that who've finally realized they actually need to adapt. And that's brilliant. That's just such a great opportunity for us all. And that, I don't think that opportunity's gone away even 2 and a bit years down the line.
And I agree with all of that. I'll yes and that. Plus, I think this was the catalyst or the combination of crises. And I put out a Tuesday tips of plan, do, check out, kind of crisis scenario planning, and just help using those muscles and having at least 3 or 4 in your back pocket of like, if this happens, we do this, we do this. And to me, the pandemic, economic impacts of that helped executives finally pay attention to volunteer services more.
Yeah.
And my work with the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, which runs here in the States as kind of an umbrella association, we've been doing and about to publish the results end of this year, early 2023, of finally surveying executive leaders and funders to see, why haven't you been talking to each other? Brilliant. Why haven't you understood strategic volunteer engagement? So just seeing the necessity of not only the tech adaptation of Zooms and WebExes and working more remotely and realizing we don't need to sit in an office and cough on each other as much anymore, I think that's been an improvement that I've seen, and the fact that whenever organizations keep going in that direction and don't abandon the hybrid approach, either hybrid work or remote opportunities for volunteers, that's where we're seeing organizations continue to be successful and resilient.
Yeah, and I think we've got almost the perfect storm, because there are some organizations who've responded, some who've just done nothing, some who've kind of regressed, they got rid of their volunteer engagement professional, they furloughed all their volunteers and didn't give any support. And now we've got the cost of living crisis, as we're calling it over here, and the inflationary rises
here too.
And now you've got volunteers stepping back because they're having to take 2, 3, 4 paid jobs in order to meet the bills. You've got volunteers who previously never claimed expenses who need to claim. So there's expense budgets being eaten up so much quicker. We've got this concept that's developing in the UK over the winter, and it is terrifying to think that a country like ours has to resort to this. But this concept of warm banks, which are places in the community where people can go and keep warm during the winter. And we're not even like Canada, when it comes to winter.
It's not even that. It's like San Francisco. Like, it gets a little bit damp and cold, but we don't really. We almost never get snow, but climate change and that's the thing. Is in these milder climates, it's still the economic climate and climate change, and everything is coming together to create again, the perfect storm. And those who are adaptable and flexible, I've seen especially informal mutual aid
Yeah,
groups have
yeah, yeah, yeah,
completely
yeah, yeah.
filled in the cracks,
Totally.
where some agencies were frozen in panic, or they move at a glacial pace because they're so big, or they're have an ancient hierarchical structure and they can't really respond to things. That's where we've seen that informal volunteering step
Yeah,
up. Has that
totally,
been the same in the UK or
totally.
Australia?
No, it has definitely been the same here. I think what's interesting is with what's coming down the line in the next few months is I'm starting to hear now organizations telling me volunteers don't want to work from home. They don't want to do hybrid remote working anymore. That's not because of, COVID or anything like that. It's because they can't afford to heat their homes whilst they're doing their volunteering.
Yeah, yeah, or run
So
the extra electricity with computers and
yeah.
everything else. Yeah.
So and there was a question asked on LinkedIn last week by Christine down in Melbourne about organizations that whether or not they reimburse volunteers expenses for things like heat, light, broadband, etc. at home. So there's all of those kinds of things. So of course what the formal organizations, some of them did after COVID, was they said we're just going to get rid of office space, we're going to get rid of all of that. Now they may find themselves in difficulty. Are the informal volunteers going to step in the way they did kind of 2-3 years ago? I've just started a blog post this morning. We had yet another change of government, and our new health secretary is calling for 1 million volunteers to support the National Health Service this winter. Now, there's no explanation of why 1 million. What are
Why
they
or
going to be
how?
doing?
Right. Why, how, what,
you know,
where,
have,
who? Yeah.
have we got enough volunteer managers in the NHS resourced well enough to recruit, screen, train, place 1 million people in the next few weeks? But what it does is it kind of, she's going on this narrative of volunteering that's still playing out over here, that there was a massive boom in informal during the first lockdown. So for us, kind of March to June, July 2020. And all those people have been sat around for the last 2 years just waiting to do more volunteering. But we know, there's research here, there were 6 million people, 6 million fewer people volunteering in the fall lockdown of 2020 than the spring lockdown, because they weren't furloughed anymore. They were working from home. They had their kids homeschooling. They had all of that kind of stuff. So we're not in a position where there are 1 million people sat around furloughed on 80% of their income watching Netflix and with nothing else to do, who can suddenly rock out and volunteer. The world has shifted over those 2 years. COVID has not been static. The global crisis financially that we're seeing has not been static. And we need to keep kind of keeping on top of that and adapting. And it's more and more of it's coming in at once. So it's adding to the complexity of what we've got to respond to, which is, for me, is really interesting, because I can't really remember a time we've had such a kind of conflagration of things happening at once. But if you're on the ground as a volunteer engagement professional in an organization, you're being told we need more volunteers because demand for services are going up. People don't want to volunteer or aren't coming back to volunteer, or the ones that do only want to do a couple of hours and they don't want to fill in an application form. And, this is tricky stuff that we need to be getting to grips with.
And yeah, and volunteers are never free. That's one of our
No.
catchphrases for the last several years among many of us who do this kind of work. And I think that's still a core leadership problem, not just in politics, but in organizations, where a leader, like, I have a great idea. Let's get 1 million volunteers, and I can do press about it, and we could do, and then you get to the practical rollout, where it's more than cart before the horse.
Yeah.
It's not data driven, it's not human centered, it's not reality
Yeah.
based.
Yeah.
and and that can be so much more harmful to the organization, to the whole team, and even to the community, who's getting mixed messages about, oh, there was that fairly disastrous app VMS rollout, or recruitment app rollout in 2021, or was that in 2020 over there?
Oh, that was the. Are you talking about the volunteer responder program?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. Back in 2020. So this was within a day or two of. I nearly called him the late great Boris Johnson, but our former Prime
If
Minister
only, yeah.
Boris Johnson announcing the lockdown was the Royal Voluntary Service, which used to be called the Women's Royal Voluntary Service, was set up around the time of the Second World War. RVS launched this initiative called NHS Volunteer Responders. And the idea would be people had a really simple application form, basic, like 3-4 questions: name, address, telephone number, email, scan a copy of your passport, your driving license. That was the application process. You'd be approved. Certain roles you still needed criminal record check, but for a lot of it, you'd be approved to like go and do a housebound person who's shielding shopping for them, or collect their prescription medicines and that kind of stuff. Within 48, 72 hours, they had 750,000 applicants.
Mm-hmm. And how many spots?
Yeah, well,
how many
exactly.
spots open? Yeah.
Just over 400,000 of those have been active, certainly as of last summer 2021. We know why they weren't enough opportunities at the start, because the statutory health services like the National Health Service, social care systems were slow to feed the opportunities through, because, hey, they were busy dealing with lockdown and COVID. If we could have predicted it was coming 3 months in advance, we could have been ready for it. But there are still people to this day who were never given anything to do. And that's not a criticism, because, you know, nobody's done that kind of stuff at scale. But what has irked me, not resulted in any change, was because it was such a scale of magnitude and such a mobilization at that kind of scale. We could have been doing research in those people who were never given anything to do. We could have been doing research into what do you feel about the fact that you were never given? How could we change? How could we do it differently, so that when a new health secretary comes in and says we need 1 million people to help with the NHS over winter crisis, we've got the learning. When a year ago, just over a year ago, people were asking for volunteers to step forward to help with the vaccination program because of Omicron kicking in, we could have learned from that. And we didn't do the research. We didn't do that learning. We didn't share it. And I feel for RVS in that, not doing that research, because I kind of get it. You don't want to air your failings, particularly when there is a tabloid media in this country who are ready to rip every charity to pieces for every single perceived and actual failing that they make. But that would have been really valuable information for us. And I don't think we're ever going to see, probably in my lifetime, that kind of scale of mobilization again, that learning opportunity again.
And
So
it's a loss of potential data, and like you said, just information, and the chance to learn from a misstep. And too often we see leadership, again, in a lot of different sectors, where the ego or the pride or saving face absolutely gets in the way of, like, this would be really great neutral data to have.
yeah, yeah,
However it makes us feel or look, this is, garbage in, garbage out. This is really
yeah.
important information, so that perhaps next time when it's, another crisis, or heaven forbid, let's not jinx it, something, more impactful in a negative way, that there's that resilience and that readiness and that response, and again, kind
Absolutely.
of scenario planning, or at least knowing that, that there is the possibility of this much percentage of all those people who registered are still interested. If you could
Yeah,
still
yeah,
re-engage them,
yeah.
and just even saying, I think, transparent communication is so important in the sector, and it doesn't happen often enough, especially that leadership level, where there's the empowerment of the director of volunteer services or the manager of the volunteers events to say, we don't have anything yet. Can we keep in touch with you and circle back in
Yeah,
6 months?
yeah,
Can we keep
yeah,
in touch with,
yeah.
is it okay for us to send you an email updates and you decide what fits when it fits in the next year? Just setting that expectation, it seems so simple, but that's a step that is skipped all the
Yeah.
time.
And look, governments of all political persuasions are going to keep coming up every now and again. It's like a cyclical thing. It's like fashion. We're back into the 80s and 90s again. They will come back. Somebody at some point will come back with the idea of, why don't we create a volunteer reserve of a few 100,000 people sitting around on their hands waiting to be asked to do something? And the kind of learning that we could have had coming out of the volunteer responders program would have been really useful to help say to government, well, okay, but this is what we found. And this is how we could engineer it so that it's better, it's improved, it's different. Or, look, we know that idea doesn't work. Nobody's fault. It just, this bit of it didn't work.
Didn't work. Yep.
And let's not waste time, effort, and energy in doing that. We don't have that learning. We don't have that learning there. And I'm not going to keep harping on about it, because it's 2 years after the fact. It's too late to do anything about it. but we missed some things, and we need to be realistic about it. We got some things wrong during the pandemic when it came to volunteer engagement. We got loads of things right as well, and that's not just in volunteer engagement, that's in our society and around the world too. So
Yeah, and I think a big difference between UK, however realistic, unrealistic, calling for we need 1 million volunteers in the healthcare services for the winter. It's like, yeah, the states, we have AmeriCorps, we have some
yeah,
strong programs. California, where I am specifically, the governor and California Volunteers Organization have organized like climate action teams and done
yeah,
some very
yeah,
specific work. Plenty room for criticism of how those rolled out,
yeah,
but in general, more successes than failures in these endeavors. But the other main way that Americans have asked, or people in leadership have asked Americans to step up and volunteer, has been for fast food corporations who
yeah,
won't pay people enough. So there's been, I
yeah,
think, a peculiarly American response to labor shortage, which is, well, what about all these unpaid people? We've run our economy on
yeah,
various types of unpaid people for hundreds of years, and we kind of only know how to keep going back to that, whether that's been prison labor and the ethical quandaries
yeah,
around
yeah,
that, or being too reliant on the volunteering sector and nonprofits and non-government organizations when the government doesn't provide the social
yeah,
safety net,
yeah,
or it cracks
yeah,
under pressure like it has.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And my views changed. I used to be absolutely dead set against volunteers doing anything that even looked or smelled like a paid job. And, nearly 30 years in the field, my eyes have been opened. I've been more realistic about some of that. Volunteers are just as capable as paid staff. Pay does not equal competence. We've had those kind of debates before. But yeah, we've got to be really, really careful about those lines of thinking. It's one of the things I pointed out about this NHS scheme is it may be incredibly well intentioned. Our new health secretary may have really thought about it deeply and have a really sound plan. I doubt it,
Or
but
not.
they may have a really sound plan for it. Even if they do, at a time when cost of living is getting harder, when more and more people are organizing and striking because they're getting minimal pay increases compared to the rate of inflation, is this really the right time to be deploying 1 million volunteers into a service where we're expecting to see people striking for fair labor rights?
Mhm. Yeah,
You know, we
exactly.
we've got to pick the hill that we need to stand on when we pick these battles, but we collectively have got a responsibility to look deeper than the initial, oh, I could get involved and help recruit those 100,000 million volunteers to, come on, is this really the better society that we want to build, that we spoke about during those dark days of the pandemic and the lockdown?
Yeah, and opportunities gained and opportunities lost, and the organizations, as we've spoken about quite a bit in blog posts and conversations with each other. I've talked to Martin J. Cowling a lot about this
Yep.
recently. That something that is a phenomenon that happens is leadership of these organizations think that a change can, I'm not dissing that you and I do great workshops or webinars, but they think that's all they need to do is
Yeah.
have a
Oh yeah.
workshop or a webinar, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, access, belongingness, disability, diversity, or if it's, a change management idea or some other kind of scheme that, like, if we have a weekend workshop or if we have a webinar, that'll get everybody up to speed. And that's just the barely scratching the surface of the conversation. Like, real systemic changes need to occur, and I haven't seen enough of that here in the
Yeah.
states, or maybe in UK or around the
Yeah.
world,
No.
that like we had a chance to really improve some pieces of society, and people kind of turned on each other like it was the zombie apocalypse, and empathy went out the door in too many instances.
Yeah. I don't think we had that to the extreme that you guys had it.
Oh, we have the
And
extreme.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't say that because you are more polarized as a society, because we've had more than our fair share of events in the last few years. Significantly, I was just reading a piece in the media today about how we're a much more liberal society than we were 10 years ago. This is some major research that's been done on kind of social values, but we're also a much more divided society. And that in many ways can be traced back to the 2016 Brexit referendum and whether people will leave or remain, etc. So I think we've had our share of divisiveness. It wasn't as extreme as it was in the States. I think about, we've of course we had COVID deniers. Just we've had that kind of crazy over here as well, but it's not been as extreme. But I do think there's been enough going on elsewhere in our life, whether it's the current cost of living crisis or frequent change of governments or what have you, that's kind of kept people's eye away from that ball of, we need to be a better place. We need to be a better society. So all through our first lockdown, people would stand on their front doorsteps and they would clap the NHS. They would clap key workers. They would clap the people that kept our society going every Thursday at 8:00. Now they're complaining because the rail workers want a better pay rise than 2 or 3%. The same people that they were clapping 2 years ago. So I think it's the short-termist nature of our society. I talked about it a lot 2 years ago. I said during that first lockdown, in the UK at least, I think we stopped becoming an economy and we became a society. We actually looked out for each other. We weren't being driven by consumerism and because all the shops were shut and all of those kinds of things. When that ended, we went straight back to being a consumerist society again. It was the Eat Out to Help Out program and all of that, and that's all kind of come back in again. And it's a shame that we didn't take a bit longer as a society or a bit stronger leadership to really think about whether or not we wanted that back in the same way.
Exactly. And it was everything you said was, turned up to 11 in the States. And California and San Francisco were quite liberal, quite progressive, were fairly insulated from other things. So this was, an area where we were probably the least impacted by that stuff, and it was still a pretty serious impact of that. Those divisions and the turn towards authoritarianism, which is not centered in empathy as a political structure.
No, exactly.
Kind of the opposite. So would people decide that's what they're going to do with their belief systems? Like, doesn't breed empathy or taking care of each other. And I think it's been a hard reality to have leaders accept that the volunteer that was delivering meals for Project Angel Food, Project Open Hand, for Meals on Wheels, now has to work for Uber Eats or DoorDash to make ends meet. And that's the reality that we're in. So when we talk about labor shortages, volunteer shortages, deaths, disability from long COVID, secondary medical stuff and economic stuff, that's, now people do have to take care of kids and elders, as with more time devotion perhaps than before. And what do you think is the ideal solution to, when you have to understand a problem before you can solve it, or you have to acknowledge that's part of the problem? But are you hoping for or helping implement or seeing solutions to the labor shortage, personnel shortage in UK? Like, what are you seeing in the next little while around that?
Well, I think our labor shortage issues are complicated. In part, we've had the same thing of people predominantly over the age of 50 who got furloughed or made redundant, not wanting to go back to that kind of job and actually having greater aspirations for how they're going to spend their time. Our labor shortages have also been exacerbated by Brexit. So a lot of people who would take on those roles that other people didn't want to do went back to their countries of origin because they didn't feel welcome in the UK anymore. And, there was a huge labour shortage as a consequence of that. Employers not paying decent wages, that's not encouraging people to go back. So it's a much bigger issue than volunteering in that regard. I think what we need, and I've just started reading a book, I can't remember the guy who wrote it, the guy's name, and it's on the opposite side of the computer, so I'm not going to reach over and grab it.
I'll put it in the notes later. I'll put it in the video description notes.
It's a book called Citizens, and the fantastic Helen Timbrell from over here recommended it to me. And it's talking about how, certainly it's written by a guy from the UK, how historically in the UK we were subjects. So we were subjects of the monarch, which technically we still are, but we knew our place. Other people made the decisions for us. Then the narrative shifted to being consumers, which is kind of where we've been and where we went back to after the pandemic. And he argues that really the solution to a lot of this kind of stuff is not looking to our institutions, sadly non-profits included, but looking to each other to come up with the solutions and really becoming active citizens. So it doesn't matter what side of the political divide you're on. If you're earning a minimum wage job and you're having to work 2 or 3 of them in order just to put food on the kids' table, that doesn't feel great. And we've got the agency to do something about it. But most of us as individuals don't feel that we do have the agency to do anything about it. And certainly some communities feel even less agency to do that. And it's the book's arguments are basically going to be about how building awareness within people's minds, yours, mine, anybody else's, that actually we can do stuff, we can take action, we can solve some of these problems ourselves. We don't have to wait for somebody else to do it for us. And I think that's going to be if that kind of movement can get some traction, I think that could be really, really interesting as a way of going forward, because it goes back to what you were saying earlier about this is informal volunteering. This isn't, people don't need an organization to change the world anymore. Mm-hmm. They need a group of like-minded individuals and an internet connection. We saw that with the Arab Spring. We've seen it with Extinction Rebellion, with all of these kinds of things. And we can tackle the issues that we're facing now in the same way. But I think at the moment, just people feel beat up and exhausted and helpless after the last 2 or 3 years.
Agreed, and it's hard to inspire hope, and that's, I think you and I have been, and Martin and Tracy O'Neill and Christine down in Australia as well, and our friend Faiza, who's now in the States but wasn't in Canada. She's now in my state. But so many of us as leaders in the sector or putting out media and content production, part of what I always want to try to do is, here's the reality, but here's an empowerment or hopeful solution that isn't magical thinking to the reality. Yeah. And I find, like, with my energy, that's harder and harder to do, because life is beating all of us down with circumstances all the time, and it seems to be accelerating. There's also been research here in the States of a lack of polls, a lack of trust in institutions, not just political institutions, but huge article in Chronicle Philanthropy, I believe, recently, last couple of months, about drop in trust of larger nonprofits, and when things like the Red Cross are having to respond more and more and more, and when there's a natural disaster, for example, hurricanes here in the Caribbean and in the States, and affecting the States and Canada and Caribbean nations, more and more you're seeing that social media, that tech aspect, that self-organizing aspect of, no shade to my friends in the Red Cross, because I have a lot of friends there, but the people in the situations themselves are like, here are our local mutual aids. Give directly to them, and don't go through these big institutions or systems anymore where, they have a lot of infrastructure in place, but we don't think it's always effective, or we don't think it gets to us in time, or we think this is more effective to give to mutual aid. And it's just the creation, I think the odd hopefulness from all of this is the creation of informal growing into more formal or organized or legally structured organizations that really fill in the needs where the government and maybe larger nonprofits have just stumbled or failed or not been able to adapt in time.
And let's face it, that's where those larger nonprofits started. 50, 100, 200 years ago. That's where they started. And I've said this for a long time. People who I can remember talking to a lady in Canada years ago, and she was talking about baby boomers, and she said they were really struggling to recruit baby boomers. They could get them to come in, but then they really didn't like the paperwork and the admin and the bureaucracy. It felt like work. And so they weren't coming back. And they did some follow-up work. And it wasn't that they were not coming back, they were going and playing golf instead. It wasn't that they were not coming back and they were going and volunteering with the agency next door, although some of them were. But what she was finding was that people have been really passionate about the organization's cause. They've been put off by the bureaucracy.
Right.
So as a Change the World generation, they've just gone to their friends, look, I don't like the way X organization's doing it. Why don't we start our own organization and do that? And there will come a point when some of those well-known, those household names, those organizations who believe they've been around for 100 years and so will be around for 100 another years, will just need to get out of the way. And they'll just need to get out of the way and let new blood and fresh energy and enthusiasm come in. And I think for me, I was looking up a quote so there's a journalist over here called George Monbiot, who's writes a lot about the environment, and he did a political piece the other day in the Guardian newspaper. But the line at the end of it, which isn't political, kind of stood out for me. He said, "We need real, inspiring alternatives, positive visions of a better world rather than the competing modifications of the ideologies that got us where we are. We need hope." And I think it's really easy for us to forget or not realize day to day that's what we're dealing in as volunteer engagement professionals. We're dealing in hope. We're dealing in hope that one person will step forward and make a difference in the life of somebody else, or to the community, or to the environment, or to the animals in the animal shelter, or whatever that will be. And every time somebody does that, it's like the cliche of the 1,000 points of light. It's, it's a moment of hope. And it's those moments of hope, you add up all of those moments to hope and you communicate them to other people. And it starts to build a movement of hope that actually can be that beacon and that shining light. It's not going to solve everything, but could elevate people's eyes up from the, oh my God, look at the world that we live in, how depressing is it now, to I can do something. And if that just inspires somebody else to do something, one other person, that makes the world a better place. And that's what we are dealing in every single day as volunteer engagement professionals. We're dealing in helping people make that change and be that hope to somebody else. And that's incredibly powerful.
It is incredibly powerful. Passion is contagious, and
Yeah.
I think hope is contagious. And it's it's part of my personal practice to kind of cultivate that, not just coming from a conservation background where that's very necessary, but I've had the honor of briefly meeting and then hearing her speak, Dr. Jane Goodall, over the years.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Our birthdays are the same week, so that was a funny joke
Cool.
a few years ago when we saw each other. And I think she's done the Goodall Institute and some others have done some great work around, again, not magical thinking, but just that you can be empowered. There is a solution, and now we're at the point where there's an app for that. We have the technology to create alternate, much more progressive, much more equitable systems, short-term and long-term. And I think that's building the bridge that's going to work next to the one that's crumbling is what's been going on. And too many leaders or larger organizations or institutions we're just going to keep shoring up this old bridge, and we're going to make these incremental little chips and changes and try to put a band-aid here and there. And that's not the moment we're in human history. We're in a much more important moment of human history to an opportunity and necessity to make these changes. And I really value that you're so consistent in that reality with hope glasses over it. And I think that's kind of what it takes, is continuing to plant these seeds of empowerment and hopefulness, and how people can respond to things on their own, even to help move from barely surviving to a thriving society where the tide raises all boats, that old saying, but that where we're genuinely all in better relationship with each other and with nature, and in the systems are working not just for a small percentage of people who may or may not have inherited their wealth and all their shiny things from conquests 1,000 years ago.
See, you're back to talking about the British royal family.
And we're back to Charles in charge, which has been my favorite meme to go around from.
But you see, even that. Now, I'm not a royalist. I'm not a big fan of the royal family. I've got no problem against them personally. I think, individually, but it's the institution I have an issue with. I think it's a kind of weird way of, in the 21st century, of being governed. I can see pros to it, but on balance, I'm not a fan. And there was a lot of ridicule of the queue.
Right.
The
British, and I think I put on your Facebook page, the most British thing to do, stand in a queue.
Exactly.
Hours
and no, the most British thing to do was joining the queue to join the queue.
Yes, the queue.
That was the most British thing to do. And they were asking people on the news one morning on BBC Breakfast, they were saying, why are you here? And the two responses I wanted to hear, I wanted one person, nobody said this, I wanted one person to say, well, in case you hadn't heard, the Queen's died. And I wanted oh, did somebody else to say, well, I just saw a line, so I thought I'd join it because that's like peak Britishness. That was,
What are we all waiting for? Is this ticket holders? Is this not
yeah,
ticket holders?
exactly. But what was interesting, and a friend of mine was challenging me about this on Facebook. Shout out to my mate Giles, and he had watched the idea of just watching everybody be interviewed in the queue was kind of filled me with dread. But he said what was really, really interesting was seeing people talking to each other, seeing people talking to journalists, seeing that sense of connection and camaraderie and common touch points and shared passion, interest, discussion of the future, etc., that came out of people, standing on a cool evening for 12 hours, 24 hours around the kind of central event of Queen Elizabeth's death. And I think that's really, even in our very selfish, consumer-driven society, that was quite a unique thing to happen. And there's something in there that, again, we've just kind of gone straight back into, period of mourning's over, let's get on with life, everything else comes straight back into the agenda, rather than actually taking a moment of stopping and saying, what can we all take away and learn from that? And I think what was especially powerful about that was that those people weren't queuing on Zoom. They weren't queuing on
They
Teams.
were in person with each other. They were with
They were
each
in
other.
person with each other, which we haven't done for 2 years. And I think for us, bringing it back to our profession, you've got brilliant events in North America, like the Hybrid Conference, which I've been a part of before, you've been a part of before, the fantastic events. And I know Points of Light was in person this year as well. But I think for all the benefits of online, and we can have more people involved and the costs are lower and what have you, that thing of just bringing us back together to network, to support each other, to inspire each other is so important. So much easier to do if we're in a room together than it is through Zoom with everybody's cameras turned off and mics muted. And I'm really looking forward. I've said, I'm doing a keynote address to a conference in November, and it's like 45 minutes long. And I've said, that's fine, but I'm not talking for the first 15 minutes. I'm basically saying, you haven't been in a room together with each other for 3 years. Go talk to each other for 15 minutes.
Get caught up.
Say hi.
Yeah, say hi.
That's the key thing. And I think as a people-driven profession, it worries me. I can understand all the reasons for it, and I see them and I understand them, but it worries me that we may not get to that point of all getting back together in a room and inspiring each other.
It could very well be, and again, it's a balance of some sort of hybrid conference where some people are in person and some can beam in remotely. To me, that checks a lot of the boxes of accessibility, travel expense, because this whole conversation, the core barrier to anybody volunteering or participating in a conference with peers of other leaders of volunteers is economic stress. I can't take the time off, I can't afford the travel, I can't, near or far, planes, trains, automobiles, whatever it is, magic dragons, whatever the form of travel is, it's that. So it's opened up accessibility, and there's that human connection. And I have another friend who consults for fisheries and ocean policy around the world, and she just got to a point for her own mental health. She's like, I can't Zoom anymore. I have to. I'm flying to Halifax. I'm flying to Portugal. I'm flying to these conferences. And they're doing things as safely as they can, and that's her comfort level. It's different than mine has had to be, and it's different than a lot of other colleagues. But I absolutely appreciate that, even in the controversy of, the royal family and colonialism, and Queen's death hits different people in different countries in different ways, but it was a magical moment where so much of the populace came together, as you said, to be with each other for a common cause with common emotions, and being able to, I think there's a deep soul importance of bearing witness with each other, of knowing that there's other people going through this with you, and it may seem like a royal funeral and a lot of pomp and circumstance, that's a very surface level thing. A surface level thing can bring people together in a genuine way.
Absolutely.
And that's so important. And we're a people driven profession, and an empathy driven profession, compassion driven profession. So anything that gets people back to those emotions resonating
Yeah,
together in a
yeah,
group, I think is going to have a
yeah.
positive impact.
And I get where you're coming from on the kind of economic thing of bringing people together. But for me, and I've spoken about this for a lot longer than COVID, what we're really good at in the nonprofit sector is looking at the cost of everything, and we're not that great at looking at the value of things.
Yep,
And
exactly.
and I think it's okay. What's it going to cost for me to travel somewhere to go to an in-person gathering? It's going to cost me this much money. What's the value of that? Now that places a responsibility on the organizers to make sure it's a really high value event. But I don't see a lot of that conversation going on in our sector. What I see is we put in place a way of working out of necessity because of lockdowns, and we've perpetuated that without really having, not everybody, but a lot of people have perpetuated it without having some really intentional thought about, is this the right way to go? Because
Mm-hmm.
those hybrid conferences that are done through VMPC and Alive and Better Impact, they're great because people are still physically together in a room somewhere in a city in the US or in Canada, and the hybrid bit is the beaming in.
Right.
I've done events in the last 9 months where hybrid was 30 people in a room and one or two people logging in on Zoom. It doesn't work.
That's not worth the that's
It,
not worth the juice isn't worth the squeeze is a
no,
phrase we
it
use in
is.
our house.
It just doesn't work. It doesn't work for people in the room because the presenter ends up having to run Zoom and a keynote and answer questions. Been there, got that T-shirt, and it doesn't work for people remotely because they can't participate really, really well in it. So it's, I suppose my thing is about what do we get from being in a room together? Why do we, what's the benefit? What's the value of that? Can we justify that? Can we really be intentional about thinking about these kinds of things? We don't have to do it as often as we did. The other big element to it is, and I'm sure you've had this, is one of the nice things for the ego when it comes to the online conferences is they always want the kind of named presenter to get
Mm-hmm.
people along. So it gives people like you, me, and many others a really great platform to be there and talking to people. But we're where we are because we were at in-person events and somebody came up and, somebody like Susan Ellis for me kind of coached and mentored and supported me, Rick Lynch, Steve McCurley, Fraser Dyer, Linda Graff, all of these great people who I saw in person, and they kind of coached and mentored. It's really difficult to do that with
Mm-hmm.
somebody on a Zoom call who doesn't feel that they can make a contribution and doesn't have their camera switched on, so you can't even make eye contact with them. And so it worries me about where that next tranche of leaders in our sector is going to come from if we don't ever have the time to meet in person and nurture. And I get a kick out of being in person. I'm a extrovert. I like being around other people. I know there's plenty of other people that never want to see another human being ever again, and they're quite happy to sit with their laptop in their room and connect with people that way. And
Yeah.
I think we need to be really intentional and thoughtful about how we get there.
And I've seen that as well, where this year Points of Light was in person with I think 700 or 800 people, under 1,000 people in the Disney World complex in Orlando, Florida, and then some more hundreds or maybe a couple thousand online. And they're usually quite successful at running these mini in-person events that you and I have met up with over
Yeah,
the
yeah.
years, and I've met many other friends and colleagues have been Points of Light or MOV or other Alive VMPC events. And there's again, not everyone has to jump on the let's do something hybrid bandwagon, and not everyone has to rush back to let's have an in-person
No,
conference
absolutely not.
because of someone has book out, or oh, we can book this good guest, we can do this. And I think that's the core question of there is value in us being together. There's value in us being together in an unstructured way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love that point of get to know each other for the first 10 or 15 minutes because you haven't seen each other in a while. I think that's something many more speakers, consultants, presenters, keynotes can and should adopt if they're not already doing that. And this does give me more hope that we can create different ways of being together. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I've been working on the last few years with a couple other colleagues is the development of the idea and then eventually the development of the technology around care circles.
Oh
That
yeah,
there's a
yeah,
much
yeah.
more holistic, complex system to set about community or volunteer advocate engagement that can involve wider and wider circles of people, of stakeholders, of folks helping each other out. And that's entirely based on just witnessing how humans have self-organized really well for mutual aid over the years. And why can't we share more of that concept? What are our predictions for the next couple of years? Because we were like 50-50.
Well, I've got a lottery ticket for tonight, so I'm going to be 14 million pounds richer tomorrow. And no,
And I am a good friend of yours, and I'm happy to help with whatever you need to do with that money.
um, predictions for the future. I go back to what I said earlier on, that a lot of the changes that we've seen in volunteering over the last couple of years have been changes I've certainly been talking about for 15 years. So in some ways, I don't think a lot's going to change. People are still going to volunteer. People are still going to turn out and do stuff. Volunteer managers are still going to exist. Volunteer centers will still exist. You know, the kind of infrastructure may look different. It may change. It may morph. But the kind of the fundamentals of kind of the architecture and the environment of the movement in which we operate will continue to be there. So, and that's a good thing. And where I think we are going to need to go is we're going to need to be much more fleet of foot in adapting. And the other thing, and I keep coming back to, I think talking to you, Dana, it just makes me hopeful. I think we need to, the ease at the moment is to say everything in the next 6 to 12 months is going to be doom and gloom. And actually, you know, we go through these cycles in the world over time. And the hardships that we're going through, certainly in our respective countries at the moment, are nowhere near as big as the hardships that people in our respective countries went through, like in World War II or the Vietnam War or something like that. So to kind of put that in perspective, I think things will get better. What we've got to do is ride this out and make sure that volunteering's in a really strong position to be that help to people in these dark days, but also be there to kind of shine that light to where the future's going as well.
I do have to hang on to hope, not just for my own mental and physical health. I'll add to your prophecy and prediction for the next little while, a couple of years. I think that the informal, as yet informal institutions that are being built up
Yeah,
are going to either formalize and start to replace these older institutions where they can't keep up, they can't adapt, and it's kind of like if you can't adapt and evolve, you're going to get left behind in the
yeah,
waves
yeah.
of change that are coming. So I'm hopeful that new systems that are being created in parallel instead of and in addition to fighting the problems with the current systems, but I think people are going to give up on shoring some of those up with larger institutions and come up with more grassroots, again, people-centered, human-centered, people-driven, and hopeful and empowering ways of shifting things for the better in society. So we'll see what happens. We'll circle back with this conversation
Yeah.
in 2023. And
Yeah, God, can you, if we meet in 2 to 3 years' time and the world's changed even more and even quicker than it did since the last time we spoke, that would be crazy. That really would be
we
crazy.
were our generation was promised jetpacks. That's where I'm drawing the
Yeah,
line.
yeah,
Is
yeah.
the Jetsons promised us jetpacks, and
It
so
was, wasn't it George Jetson's day of birth this year at some point? So
it was where there was a funny little celebration and memes online. But I have hope for the future. It's always inspiring to talk to you, Rob, as a friend, as a colleague across the pond, and I hope that one of our next Priceless Advice conversations is either here in the States over a beverage or in UK in your country, or maybe even we'll both have a trip to Australia and we'll get to see our friends down there. But that human
that would be
connection
great.
means a lot to me in all of our mediums together. So thank you, the Rev
Thank you, Dana.
Jackson, for taking time today.
Thank you very much, Dana. Cheers.